Town Media. What's up, Josh?
What's up, Greg? How you doing?
Pretty good. I don't have my seatbelt on. You do?
Yeah, it's instinct at this point.
Driving with me.
Well, yeah.
Law-abiding citizen.
You never know what happened.
Well, I know what just happened. We just had a sweet interview.
We had a very sweet interview at the very sweet studio. First time we got to actually record in a studio. First time I think we recorded live with a guest. Actually, first time we had a guest.
Yeah, Nerd Splurge, not usually a guest-oriented show. Now it might be, but we just had a super cool time. Like, some of you that follow my other podcast, Sets and Reps, may know a little bit about the origins of the show, where me and Josh were supposed to do a co-host thing together, but this is pretty cool, a little bit of a full circle happenstance that allowed us to kind of have a first time in the studio, which is what Josh just mentioned. So I'm super excited about it. I learned a lot about the history of comic books, and it's vast history, very rich. So there's
a lot of history.
You can't really talk about all of it in one setting. So we did what we came to do. Let's get it. So stay tuned.
It'll be good.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us for this episode, this piece of Nerd Splurge. Me and Josh started this because we just have such a great love for comic books and superheroes and talking about all things pop culture and nerdiness. And I feel like this episode is going to be pretty great for us to learn a lot about not only the history of comic books, but how that history has changed, how they've become more relevant to this day. And this super awesome studio, too. I want to kind of give a quick shout out to the Town Media for letting us come through and record here. So Dave, like I said, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. And Town Media always does an amazing job. So we're in this beautiful bunker, if you would, with people talk about brick and mortar being by the wayside, but here we are, surrounded by brick and mortar. So it's very cool. Yeah, no, I'm very excited. I've been a collector since I was 10 years old, actually. My mother, I grew up in Nashua, New Hampshire, and my mother would drop me off at the corner market where my grandfather worked on the weekends because I would like to go visit my friend who lived in the house behind him. So I would get dropped off and wait for him to get off of work. And while waiting for him to get off of work, there would be comics, and at the time they were 20 cents each. My mother would always give me $1, so I would read as many as I could there while waiting, and then I would take 5 and go home. And tears came to my eyes when comics went from 20 to 25 cents. Let me tell you, it was a sad day. And my grandfather was like, "Oh, I'll give you a quarter, Davey. Don't you worry, And but the point was, my mother was like, "If you don't take good care of your books, I'm gonna, not give you any more money, and that's the way it goes." And so I meticulously, back then we didn't have bags and boards like you see that we have here, but back then I would lay them back to back, and so spines wouldn't get ruined and so on. And I kept them in these 2 big microwave boxes. Back then microwaves looked like the size of refrigerators in the 1970s. And I had one of those stories where you always hear people say, "Oh, my mother threw away all my baseball cards," or "My mother threw away all my comics." I was in college, and the family was moving because we were downsizing. And my mother called me up and she said, we found all your comics in the big boxes, and a guy offered me $100 for them, and I figured I'd better call you up. And I'm like, "Well, no, Mom, those are my books. I've had them forever. They're mine. I don't want to get rid of them." And she goes, "Okay, I'll tell him." And good thing she did, not sell them. And the funny thing is, she said if he had offered me $10, I would have told him to take them all. But when he said $100, that must mean that they have to have some value. Yeah. And so she called me up and she's like, "Do I get rid of them?" And I said no. And thank God, because it all, in the 1970s, there were first appearance galores of everybody. And those comic books ended up, coming back and, being quite valuable after, looking through them and seeing what I actually had there. So it was kind of neat. But then I moved to Milford in 1990, and I just kept on keeping with the hobby and kept on being a comic enthusiast. And you know, now times are different. Back then I was just a collector, but you know, since the movies came in on the scene and the popularity going from, you know, geek to chic, I literally was able to you know, turn it into a hobby slash business. And now that I retired from teaching at the Milford school system, you know, many people know I'm a DJ as well. Between DJing and my comics, that's what I do.
Thank you so much for that. Before we explore that concept of geek to chic and kind of what that means for this, I had a question about when you were younger and back when people first kind of started building an interest. Did anybody know, or was anybody talking about how later on they would have value, as you mentioned, or was that not as important as just consuming and absorbing?
No, it's a great question, Greg. And a lot of times it's the things that you play with when you're younger that you have no idea are going to be worth what they are today. And that's a pop culture trend, if you would. You know, you look at lunch boxes, you look at baseball cards that people put in their spokes. You know, back then we would take our comic books quite often. And I mean, I took care of mine because of the overarching dollar that I would lose, but a lot of people would just roll them up, stick them in their back pocket and ride their bike home. So when you look at the concept of scarcity or value, like what makes a comic book valuable, there's a number of things. It's first appearances, it's first artwork, if you were a death of somebody. But on top of that also is the scarcity factor of, well, how nice looking is it? Yeah. You know, is it in really good shape, or is it in a reader copy, as many people would say, or is it beat up, you know? Yeah. And so, you know, when you look at some of the prices of these big books that you see now in 2021, a lot of that has to do with not only the scarcity of the quality of the book, but, you know, the relevance of that book in general. You know, an Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spiderman, you know, basically when you look at, you know, Spiderman comes out in August of 1962. This was an afterthought story, but in October, I'm sorry, in September, a 9.6 copy of the highest known copy in terms of grading sold for $3.6 million. So that's the highest price to date. Yeah. You know, for a comic. And a lot of people hear about Action Comics #1 first Superman, or Superman #1, or Detective Comics 27 first Batman, or even Spider-Man #1. But Amazing Fantasy 15 right now is the record for the highest selling single issue of a comic, because of the high grade. 9.6 meaning a mint plus book. To try to find that in near mint, you know, in the shape that it's in, was practically impossible. So that commands a premium. Yeah. Now, obviously, you have to have the right finances to purchase something like that.
Yeah, of course. You know? I could not afford a 3.6 million comic book.
Exactly.
Priorities.
But it's just like the billionaires that are rushing to make space, you know, a public thing. Yeah. You know, it's like, oh, I've got the money to spend. You know, in fact, one of the classic stories is Nicolas Cage. Everybody knows Nicolas Cage's superheroes, played a number of superhero roles and so on. He had the best known copy of Action Comics #1 that he bought at an auction for a little over $1 million, maybe it was $2 million. And it subsequently got stolen from his house, and then it was returned. But point being, a lot of the people that have a good amount of wealth, to some people, it's a fun hobby / investment, because if you really look at comics as an investment, like you were saying back then, what you know today, people who bought an Amazing Fantasy for 15 cents, I mean for 12 cents, that's a really good return for $3.6 million. Like, I can't think of any stock that probably would have had that amount of return. Yeah. In fact, just as an aside, not to go down different rabbit holes, one of the classic comic collections was owned by Jerry Garcia, the lead guitarist of the Grateful Dead. And when Jerry Garcia passed away, the fight wasn't over his music, the rights to his music by the family. The family fought over his comic book collection because they knew how valuable his comic book collection was. And Jerry Garcia had bought numerous hard to find Golden Age, which is pre-1960 books, you know, numerous Golden Age goodies that you would never find, you know, and that's what he invested in. And so, yeah, you know, some people do look at it as the investment side. Other people look at it as the nostalgia fanboy side. There's a lot of different ways you can approach comics, but I think in the 1950s and 60s, nobody knew that comics in 2010. If you had it, you know, if Marty McFly was around and we could go back and, you know, go to the comic book shelf and pick up different books. A lot of comic book geeks have talked about that. You know, what books would you go back and get? You know, and what time vault? Where would you put them and hide them and all that? And so yeah, it's pretty funny. But that you know, there's a lot of things like that. Pokemon cards, you know, like we said, baseball cards, stuff like that. Pop culture, you never know what's gonna kick in. In fact, I think it was the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin. At the end, he ends up marrying the girl by selling all of his toys and books and stuff that he had collected that had near mint boxes that they never opened up the box. And that's the most disheartening thing when you see a parent going, "I'm buying you this toy, but I don't want you to play with it." so it does struggle.
There's definitely been like a big change in, we'll say the popularity of comic books, and how there was a time, you had been talking to us like kind of before this recording, there was a time when there was kind of one stereotypical like nerdy audience that would consume this content, and then it had kind of changed to becoming more of a mainstream thing that was gaining bigger popularity. So
yeah, and I think where that happened was with the movies. You know, like when you look at when Marvel went bankrupt. I mean, Marvel. A lot of people don't realize Marvel actually went bankrupt, sold to Disney. You know, and when Disney took over Marvel, a lot of the movies that came out subsequently from that, you know, the Spiderman movies, you know, the Captain, like if you look at the Marvel universe, if you would, to Disney, you know, and you can even go on the Disney. I'm not plugging the Disney Channel. I'm just saying you can go on the Disney Channel and they actually have the actual timeline of like what the movies would be like in the order that you would want to watch all the Marvel superhero movies. Yeah. And when those movies came out, when the DC movies came out, you know, a lot of mainstream people just started watching those movies, and it reignited because a lot of people knew about Spider-Man, or they knew about Captain America, or they knew about the X-Men, but they weren't real fanboys and so on until all of a sudden the movies started to become popular. Now you look at movies like The Avengers, right? The #1 movie of all time, if you would, Black Panther, Wonder Woman, you know, these movies are, you know, taking on social issues, empowering different minority groups and so on. So you have had, I mean, like when not for nothing, you know, Chadwick Boseman, you know, sadly he's passed, but Chadwick Boseman did so much for the African American community by having the release of Black Panther. It was incredible. Wonder Woman has done so much to empower women, regardless of whether you watch, you know, read superhero comics or not. It was amazing. So I think the geek to chic part was now that it's on screen, and a lot of that has to do with CGI too. Before CGI, I mean, there were horrible flop comic superhero shows. In fact, there was a Fantastic Four one that was so bad it never even got to the cinemas. They just left it on the floor, and there are copies. There are bootleg copies when you go to Comic Cons that sell the, you know, and it's just. Yeah, it just doesn't happen. So I think CGI graphics absolutely overhauled the way the movies were produced and brought people in, you know. In fact, the running joke now is all the A-listers are trying to figure out what superhero could they be or villain could they be cast as. You know,
really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
You know, they all want in because, I mean, well, look at Scarlett Johansson, right? Yeah. I mean, she just got into a legal battle with Disney about, you know, the Black Widow, but you know, her, you know, Robert Downey Jr., like without a doubt, Robert Downey Jr.'s acting career absolutely gets reinvigorated with Iron Man. Before Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. sadly was a troubled guy who had, you know, kind of did the Brat Pack movies with the John Hughes genre in the 1980s, got himself mixed up into, you know, some bad habits and wasn't really going anywhere. When he took over as Iron Man, and Iron Man itself was actually a, you know, just a regular superhero who had his ups and downs, and he even had some issues, like the classic cover of Iron Man 128 is Demon in a Bottle, with Iron Man being an alcoholic, and there's a 10-issue storyline about this from issues 120 to 130, and you know, Iron Man was just an average character. He wasn't like a Marvel mainstream. I mean, he was up there. He had his own title and everything, but he wasn't, I would say, A-list Marvel, if you would. And once Robert Downey Jr. took over, Iron Man just blows up. Everybody and their brother is like, "Oh my God, Iron Man!" He embodied that character. He made it amazing. And then after that, you start to see all these other superheroes. You know, how can we embody these superheroes? We got to get the right character. There's got to be the right personality. I mean, look at Batman, right? Batman. You've had Val Kilmer. You've had George Clooney. You've had Michael Keaton. You've had Christian Bale. Like, look at all the people. What's his face? Ben Affleck, right? Yeah. You look at all the people that they've tried out at Batman, but nobody's really stuck, you know. No. Marvel has had the luxury of having many of their superheroes stick.
That's true. That's a good point. Because then you can embody, like, the fans can associate more, like, as you were saying, the actor kind of will embody that character. Someone like Robert Downey Jr. alone just, like, looks a lot like Tony Stark.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, even something as simple as that will make the character more poignant.
I think they also will tend to draw the character to look more like the actor if it blows up, if it gets popular.
Yeah.
Well, modern day books, right? The comics that are coming out now, they're actually drawing the covers with, like, alternate or variant covers with the actual, the character. And that's why, like, when Chadwick Boseman died, everybody was like, "Oh my God, Black Panther." And it's like, well, no, he was just a character who played Black Panther. We can find another one. And look at the people. No, you can't. Chadwick Boseman was Black Panther, you know? And so it is interesting, the psyche of our society, once they associate it, well, the Harry Potter syndrome, right? Gilligan syndrome. You know, Bob Denver, who played Gilligan, was like, "My life is ruined because I can never get cast. I've already been typecast now as Gilligan. And that was the same with Harry Potter, who... I can't even remember what's his.
Daniel
Radcliffe. You're right. It's Daniel Radcliffe's like, "Look, I got to get away from this. I don't want to grow up my whole life with, like, here, there's that Harry Potter kid, you know." And so you don't want to get typecast if you're an actor, but many of these new actors do. Gal Gadot, Linda Carter. I grew up with Linda Carter, had a poster of her on my wall. But Gal Gadot has done wonders for Wonder Woman. You know what I mean? Literally, like, people look at her now as the face of Wonder Woman. Yeah. I would be shocked if you could cast. I mean, they had back in the 70s. Then it was Kathy Lee Crosby. They casted as Wonder Woman, and she was blonde. You know, it's like, come on, you know. So, like,
it doesn't quite work the same, but
it didn't work at all. Where Gal Gadot, spot on. People said that was a casting. You know, Harley Quinn is that girl,
Margot Robbie.
Margot Robbie, yeah. Margot Robbie plays an amazing Harley Quinn. But if you look at all the others, you know, many of the other, Jason Momoa plays a really good Aquaman. But the difference is, if you look at old Aquaman compared to Jason Momoa Aquaman, two different stories. Yeah. Aquaman in the 1960s was a blonde with gold and green costume, who looked like, like, who's the kid that nobody wants to play with on the playground, right? Now you look at Jason Momoa and everybody's like, wow, I want to go swimming with him, you know? So it's a much, much different, how do you revamp those characters?
Yeah, while also keeping true to the spirit of the old characters without making it too corny, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Was there a time when the audience became specifically targeted, I guess, for older individuals? Or has it always been everyone can find some appreciation for this?
Well, I think modern day there's a lot more targeted audiences because DC and Marvel together but command about 80% of the comic industry of what people read, and then there's about 20% which are independents. You know what I mean? So under the umbrella of DC and Marvel, you find that they do want to branch out, and they want to come out with let me see if I can show you here. Like there's kid version things, like there's stuff like Heathcliff that, or Ewoks, or A-Team, or Super Friends from DC. These were all geared at kid, to get kids involved. ISIS, which was a 1970s TV show, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. These are all definitely geared towards kids. So you had, you had Marvel and DC obviously looking at that, and then like recently with the adults, you see titles like the Dark Knights titles like Black Panther and Daredevil and so on from Marvel to go after the adults. And also from DC, you had a Vertigo line, which went to like Hellblazer and, Sandman, Mystery Theater and Sandman themselves.
Oh, wow.
A lot of these were darker, a little more grittier, to try to like appeal towards an older audience. And the idea behind that is older audiences wanted better character development. They wanted, language was a little different. Maybe certain situations were different that you wouldn't want to show kids. And so recognizing that, Marvel and DC both have tried, to make a conscious effort, if you would, towards their readership. Comics have changed and evolved, literally from the 50s to today because of that. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later on that, but even like more so where some of the evolving is like DC has gotten really, I don't want to say hung up, but to try to appeal to a lot of their, to their more mature readers and so on. They try to do more of an artwork where it's actually portrait art. So if you look at a lot of the some of the DC portrait arts, they're like compared to a regular comic cover. You know what I mean? Like here's a regular comic cover, but here's DC portrait art.
Yeah.
And so what they're trying to do is make books that you could kind of put on your wall and attract the reader. So a lot of them, have very little writing, and it's more artwork, and obviously more realistic and so on like that. And so, recently you're starting to see DC do that just to try to attract a certain level of reader, if you would.
Yeah, it's almost an artwork and more than just a story.
Well, it is, and the different artists, in fact, different artists have their own little following. For example, a lot of people like an artist called Scotty Young, and what Scotty Young does is, even though the storyline, is a regular adult type storyline, he draws the more of a comic-y picture with big heads and so on like that. So everybody who follows Scotty Young knows, like when you go to the bookstore, the comic book store, and you see a Scotty Young cover, you know right off the bat it's Scotty Young, because nobody else really draws.
It's very distinct.
Everybody will try head proportionate to body, stuff like that. But Scotty Young always has like the oversized heads, if you would.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and so artists will try to get their own following. Todd McFarlane was a huge artist for Marvel, drawing Spiderman, and in fact in 1990 he revamped Spiderman. New title, Spiderman #1, sold 3.5 million copies. But then in the 1990s, when Jim Shooter was the president of Marvel, or editor-in-chief, a lot of them were upset, and so a lot of the artists were upset. So Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Mark Silvestri, Rob Liefeld, they all split off and they went to form Image Comics. And under the Image title, their top selling comic is Spawn and Walking Dead. Those are titles that, McFarlane, under the Image comic title, but a lot of people will follow the artwork. People like artists and they'll follow what their artwork is.
Yeah.
Maybe this is sort of a kind of a loaded question because it's such a vast existence, or there's like many options to choose from, right? Like you go to a restaurant and it's always hard to order your food because the menu has a lot of options on there. So I guess if you were to, seeing as how you've had an investment, a personal investment for a while in comics, like if you were to talk to the casual person who like let's say we know that Spider-Man's like your favorite, one of your favorite comic heroes. So if someone, for example, was going to ask you how they would get into reading Spider-Man comics along that vein, any comics in general, where I guess, would you tell them to start? Like, since there is such a
We could always sit there and say start at the beginning, and it's not hard to either. A lot of people sit there and say, "Oh, but I have to buy a Spider-Man #1 or an Amazing Fantasy that we just said was over $3 million." But the reality is there's a lot of graphic novels, and there's a lot of readers right now that have put those books together, like the early issues in hardbound binders even. Marvel Masterworks is a really well-known one that does that, and it literally reprints all all of their books. In fact, Marvel Tales is a Spider-Man comic title that just reprinted all the Amazing Spider-Man books because they knew that the early Spider-Man books were very expensive, and they wanted people to have a copy. And what would they do? Well, you could pick up the Marvel Tales for cover price and have that same issue from that was 12 cents in 1963. So it's not hard, and even online now there's digital media. You can buy into the digital memberships online and read them on the computer if you want. But it's almost like a Kindle versus the book. I've always felt that having the book is so much more richer. But the reality is it's not expensive to start a title, because you can get the Masterworks versions, you can get the the readers where they have them together, and it's very, very easy. In fact, a lot of omnibuses right now is another name that you might hear that have like a whole 70 issues, if you would, and people try to do that. They'd rather have that, and as opposed to trying to hunt down all the issues, and it's literally like a huge graphic novel at that point, these omnibuses. So people try to do that, but I think there's so many superheroes out there that it's easy for you to find an attraction to one of them, or any of them, and so a lot of times, like for example, I do love Marvel, I do love Spider-Man, but I always loved the Justice League of America titles from DC because it had multiple heroes in it. Like you always had your main core of Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Martian Manhunter, Flash, Superman, Batman, but then you always had these oddball ones coming along, the Atom, Green Arrow, Green Lantern, and it was cool. It was just like, wow, this is really neat, So where there was multiple characters in the title, that's what kind of made superheroes fun for me. And so anybody who likes that, like if you like the Avengers, if you like the Defenders, or X-Men, all under these titles, there's numbers of characters that are in those comics, and people, will resonate towards one of them, and then once that happens, you can track them down from there and go that route if you choose. But I think just picking up any book and starting to read is always a good sign, because literacy is always important. Plug for my wife as an educator, Nice. But for the most part, it's not hard now. A lot of stores like Newbury Comics and so on have tons of the graphic novels. The Milford Public Library have graphic novels. You can get them for free if you're a student. All of the school libraries. I know Milford High. Not only do we actually have a little comic corner that I helped create, but our librarian Kim Palmer has constantly ordered graphic novels because she knows that kids like to read superheroes, and the graphic novels are a great way for kids to grab onto.
That's amazing, and I like what you said about how multiple characters gives you multiple things to like, or multiple ways that you can connect with characters, and certain things about them resonate for you.
And actually, Marvel used to use that as jump-off zones. Like when they wanted to try characters, the Avengers were always sort of like the let's try this character type thing and see how that works. But then also in the 1970s, there were two titles. One was called Marvel Team Up, and the other one was called Marvel 2-in-1. And Marvel Team Up was always Spider-Man and somebody else. It ran for 150 issues. And it was only like 3 or 4 issues where it wasn't Spider-Man, and it was usually the Human Torch and somebody else. But it was always Spider-Man and somebody else. And Marvel 2-in-1 was always the Thing and somebody else. And so they always kind of brought in a character to kind of get the feet wet and warm them up that way, which is kind of neat. And if you collected those titles, it's like, oh wow, Nighthawk, or oh wow, Mockingbird, or and so it was really kind of cool to read Spider-Man and somebody else and see what they were
Would those
like.
have a lot of first appearances then?
Marvel Team Up had first appearances of Captain Britain in issues 65 and 66, and Mockingbird in 95. but for the most part, like Marvel Team Up 8 was an early appearance of Ghost Rider.
Okay.
Marvel 2-in-1 Annual 2 was a Thanos early appearance.
Really?
So they did have, and it's a great, it's a great question. Like, is this where you first see them? It was usually like the B-listers that they were trying to pull up and get people to kind of read a little more of, But for the most part, you did have a few appearances that were the first. Early Marvel Team Up that had like the third appearance of Spider-Woman. So they were there. Marvel Team Up 53 and 54 had John Byrne's first work on as with the Hulk and so on. So they were there. But again, it was you collected at the time to read the stories and the continuity, if you would. So
it's cool because you have some characters who I feel like they're not as good on their own, but once you put them in a group, they really start to shine because of that group dynamic and their own personalities within that group. They're like foils. They help to bring out the other characters.
Well, Hawkeye's a really good example of that.
Yeah.
Like Hawkeye was like,
This dude.
It's all of a sudden he's an Avenger, and they're like, oh, cool. Scarlet Witch and Pietro, right? They make their first appearance, I want to say, in X-Men 4 or 5 under the evil Brotherhood of Mutants. And then the next thing you know, they become Avengers. And once they became Avengers, yay. But you never see a Quicksilver book on his own. It just wouldn't happen. The Vision makes his first appearance in Avengers 57, and like the Vision becomes a really I would argue him and Captain America were probably the two cornerstone figures of the Avengers, but he doesn't come along till 57 issues later. Captain America is obviously Avengers number 4, first Silver Age appearance of Captain America, but Vision 5 years later, and those two basically are arguably the cornerstone, I would say. Same with X-Men, like when John Byrne, when Chris Claremont started his run on X-Men with X-Men 94 with Wolverine and Storm and all those guys, and also Giant Size of number 1 is there kind of competing for when their first appearance happened. But the Chris Claremont run on X-Men to this day is considered the best run, and that's like 94 to 140, if you would. But then like Gambit comes in like 266, and Gambit's tried to have his own individual series, and nobody. It's like, Gambit.
There was a movie that they were going to try to come out with, but I don't even know when that's going to be because they have like several different actors. Maybe we'll.
Nobody wants to play Remy LeBeau
with his deck of cards. So I want the audience to kind of get to know like who your like character that you really enjoy, and it's kind of appropriate since we're hyped for the new Spider-Man movie that's coming out, No Way Home.
No Way Home is going to be crazy because I'll give you the pros and cons. Okay, I'm not going to. The pros are you're going to see a whole multiverse of characters, from what I understand, which I think is really cool. The cons
that's a concept like our casual listeners like wouldn't quite.
Right. There's going to be, you name the character. Yeah. There's going to be variations of Spider-Man. They'll probably I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know any spoilers because like Marvel's always tight-lipped. But you might see Spider-Gwen. You might see Michael Morales. Actually, we already know you're going to see Michael Morales. I think as a Spider-Man. Miles Morales. As a Spider-Man. There's going to be they might bring back Andrew Garfield and
Tobey Maguire.
But they're going to have to be like different characters, like in this multiverse. The downside though is like if like anybody who watched the Flash TV series on the CW CW. It was really good until they started to get Earth 1, Earth 2 involved, because then it became convoluted and you kind of lost track of like how do things really fit. And so I get a little nervous. Like every time you see the multiverses, it makes me go back to like when DC did their Infinite Crisis and their different Elseworlds and all these different things. And it's really, really easy to like, get mind boggled. And a lot of times people love the superhero movies because they're fun and it's entertaining, and you don't have to think a heck of a lot. You know, you just like to watch Hulk smash. Yay, it's fun. And hear like Thor make a couple funny comments and so on like that. And you could, can you dive into the characters? Yeah, a lot of people really soak into many of the characters, and it's very. I've seen people move to tears at some of the movies. But you don't want to get them having to get into the muddle of the multiverse, if you would, and you don't want them to try to dissect things and go, oh well, okay, well that makes sense because, and if you don't have any Queen's Gambit, right, was an amazing movie on Netflix, and I loved it, and but I played chess all throughout high school and stuff anyway. You could watch Queen's Gambit and know nothing about chess and love that movie and that series, and everybody who did. You don't want them to have to get drawn into knowing about the Marvel universe too much. You know what I mean? So my fingers are crossed. I hope the movie, is a good entertaining movie versus well, unless you didn't know that, you don't get that. You know what I mean? And that's what I kind of struggle with a little. A lot of people come to me, and they'll see the movie and be like, was that anything like the comics, And the reality is, if you look at the Avengers Infinity Crisis and stuff, that was nothing like the 6-issue series. Spider-Man, the Spider-Man movies, nothing per se in real life, like in the comic books. There's a few, obviously, things that you have to keep or else the fan base goes nuts. But there's a lot of things. Well, for example, the very first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, right? In that Spider-Man movie, on the bridge, it's Mary Jane Watson who gets thrown off the bridge, and Spider-Man, she dies. But in real life, it's Gwen Stacy. And that actually comes from Spider-Man 121 and 122, which are, without a doubt, one of the greatest story arcs in the history of Marvel Comics, the death of Gwen Stacy. But in the movies, in Spider-Man #1, that was Gwen Stacy. That was Mary Jane Watson, not Gwen Stacy. So a lot of us who knew the comics were like, wait, that was Gwen Stacy, not Mary Jane. And other people said, well, so then you must have hated the movie because, and it's like, well, no, I'm not a purist. I don't, as long as the movie was entertaining and enjoyable, I like it, Suicide Squad, really good example. Everybody's like, well, that wasn't like the same story, but it was entertaining. It was fun. It was worth watching. So I don't know. I think the hard part is like when you try to get too intricate with the movie, it might lose some of the readers. They don't want to go online and start reading what did I miss. You know what I mean?
I want to see something original. I don't want to be watching something I've already read. I think it's cool when they take inspiration from the books. I think that's the way to do it and get inspired. But produce something original.
And not only do they try to do that, but they do try, we were talking about how do you expand your roles to the different audiences. You have an African American playing Nick Fury now. You have, Mary Jane actually in the new Spider-Verse movies is an African American girl and so on. And you start to branch out, if you would, and you start, bringing in different roles and different ethnicities and so on. And Marvel is really trying to be cognizant of trying to be all inclusive, if you would. And I think that's a real step forward. If you looked at the 1970s, if you brought in an African American hero, oh my God, what a shock. It had black in the title. Black Panther, Black Goliath, and it's just like, come on,
Black Lightning.
Black Lightning, right? And it's like, come on, Black Canary actually wasn't, but you just sat there and you're like, come on, let's try to be a little bit more, sensitive and so on. And in the 70s and stuff, it didn't really matter because that sadly was the time. But fortunately, we've evolved since then, and people are starting to become a lot more inclusive and so on. So I give kudos to that for sure.
Those titles, Black Panther and Black Lightning, is that kind of when you started seeing comic books discussing more, I guess, social themes and social commentaries and kind of having more, is that the period of history kind of when that started happening?
Well, it's funny, those social themes started in the 1960s, and part of that was because of the way Marvel decided to approach comics. And we were talking a little bit earlier about taking adult themes and so on. and having, you know, problems that you could air out in the comic books. People read Spider-Man, people like myself, not to see who the villain was that he was going to beat up. They wanted to know the other stories about his relationship with Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson and Harry Osborn. I mean, look at Spider-Man. Your best friend is your roommate, whose dad is your arch enemy, the Green Goblin. Your boss, J. Jonah Jameson, hires you to take pictures of Spider-Man so that he can ruin him in the Daily Bugle. You're constantly being, you know, terrorized in school because you're a nerd, and you get people like Flash Thompson that want to beat you up on a daily basis. You're fighting about, like, you know, girl problems, you know, and you never, and every time you finally think you catch a break and you're all set to go out on a date or something, your spider sense tingles and you got to go off and you got to blow them off. And so there was constantly, you know, like one problem after another, and as a reader, you just sat there and you're like, oh my gosh, this poor kid, right? Like, and all these themes that were going on. So it wasn't like he was fighting the Rhino or the Green Goblin or, you know, this Chameleon. It was those other stories that kept you really attached. But then with those other stories, they started to get into the social commentary, you know, and psychedelics and so on like that. In fact, like to draw readers in the 60s, Mark Steranko, who was actually Jim Steranko, I'm sorry, who is a very famous artist, did a lot of work on, you know, with psychedelics and so on like that, which was really cool. Spider-Man started to take on different storylines, like in, you know, in Spider-Man 259, they, you know, you wouldn't know it unless you read it, but in the story it goes into how Mary Jane's background in her life, you know, how she grew up in an abusive family, and this is what led her to want to be on theater, to do stage and theater, because that's where she found acceptance and so on like that. In fact, we were talking a little earlier about how Marvel was approached by the you know, Department of Welfare and you know, Department of oh my gosh, it's killing me, Human Services, to do an issue on drugs, and so they actually did a 3-issue series of Harry Osborn in college, you know, taking LSD, you know. But DC did the same thing in Green Arrow and Green Lantern. With in issue 85, I want to say, where they had Speedy, Green Arrow's sidekick, kind of, you know, dealing with drugs, appropriately named Speedy, right? Yeah. You know, so, you know, and there's a classic cover. I wish I had the comic still, but, it, you know, he was sitting there literally with a needle in his arm. You know, so they've taken on a lot of social issues. When 9/11 happened, you know, there was a very famous black Spider-Man cover commemorating 9/11, you know, just as a, hey, we want to just commemorate it. But the reality was, even through the 70s, they were always taking on issues, if you would. For example, you know, there was all these free comics. One, you know, and Spider-Man was a lead because everybody loved Spider-Man. You know, this issue dealt with child abuse, you know, so kids could read it and learn that there was somebody to call. This also, in Smokescreen, what do you think Smokescreen was about? Smoke screen. Yeah. The enemy's smokescreen. What do you think they were trying to tell kids not to do? Smoke, right? And so, like, we don't want kids smoking, and so Smokescreen makes an appearance a few times. Also, child abuse again with the New Mutants. They wanted to make an issue, Power Pack, more child abuse that they don't want. You know, they didn't want. You know, and also more. You know, child abuse constantly. Did they have fun stuff? Yeah, the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. You know, missing. You know, it was kind of neat social commentary. Back to school issues. You know, how to get kids going back to school with Spider-Man and the Hulk. This was really interesting. This is AIM toothpaste, you know, learning personal hygiene, you know. So there was a lot of, you know, there was a lot of social commentary. And this was actually, yeah, I know, you can get, if you buy the toothpaste, you get the comic, but it was also telling you, you know, how to take good care of yourself. This was a UNICEF book. This is a really fun Spider-Man edition with the trial of Venom. And it was basically, you know, the money that was spent on this would go to UNICEF. So there was always, like, there was tons of causes and issues that comics really did try to deal with. You know, recently, you know, with the gay and lesbian LGBTQ community, you start to see Alpha Flight recognizing, the first homosexual superhero. Just recently, in the last few weeks, you see how Superman now is going to have a reboot. I think it's a nephew or somebody who's going to come out as bisexual. So they, Kamala Khan, who was the first. There was Captain Marvel, obviously. In this case, it was Carol Danvers, but Kamala Khan was the very first Muslim superhero. In fact, your governor, your old governor and U.S. Senator Maggie Hassan, a child of hers has a hearing issue, and they actually an artist created a superhero who was deaf.
I remember that
for Maggie Hassan. And it was really kind of neat, and
Blue Ear, right?
I honestly,
it was like he's a young boy.
Yeah.
Was deaf, so Marvel created that hero based on him. That's cool. I remember that.
So yeah, it is kind of interesting. Like when you look at the social issues, we in the '60s especially, there was a lot of the social issues that were coming up that Marvel dealt with, and DC didn't. And Marvel and DC actually would meet and say, why is Marvel taking all of our market share? And they couldn't figure it out. In fact, Stan Lee, as a joke, started, because they were like, well, it must be the bubble writings that they're doing and this and that. And Stan Lee would tell his people, keep that up and let them think that that's what we're doing. But really, it's because our stories are social commentary, Vietnam issues, spying issues, in the 1960s, there were spies and issues like that. So Black Widow becomes comes in and Tales of Suspense 52, I want to say, is a Russian spy. And then Crimson Dynamo comes in Avengers somewhere in the 50s, and he's the, Crimson Dynamo is like the Soviet super spy, and so there's a lot of issues like that where, depending on what the time was. In fact, I wish I had my comic. Barack Obama's on the cover with Spiderman in one of the books. They bring in a lot of the superheroes. They bring in a lot of the topics that are current now, so that people can kind of follow along with it.
How does that reconcile with the continuity? Like how is Spider-Man still in college then? If he was around for Vietnam and now is with Barack Obama.
Yeah, how is that?
That's a good point.
But actually, he's not in college anymore. If you look at the new title, oh my gosh, and I forget who.
He's got a kid now, and he's married, right?
He's got a kid. He's married. He had a corporation that failed. He got divorced from Mary Jane, and now they're friends. And Nick Spencer, that's who the writer is. The current series now, which has 77 issues, and Nick Spencer just did issues 1 through 75 and just retired from it. Peter Parker is late 30s, I would say, at this point, early 40s. Like I said, he had a corporation that kind of went defunct. He got divorced from Mary Jane. There's been a lot of reboots, things that have happened. This multiverse that you're going to see, the Spider-Man in the multiverse, there's 2 storylines that it's aligning to. One is the One More Day, and the other one is, One More Day and No Way Out, I want to say. And the One More Day storyline is after the Civil War series, there was Civil War, Spider-Man gets revealed as Peter Parker. And throughout the entire history of Peter Parker, he always wore his mask and stuff because he didn't want anybody he knew around him to get hurt or threatened or killed. In this case, he knows the world knows who he is now, so he asks Mephisto, a bad guy, for one more day to go back and actually erase everybody's memory that knew that Spider-Man was Peter Parker. Well, when he does that, it erases Mary Jane's as well, and she has no idea, and what do I do? In the movie, it looks like it's going to be Doctor Strange that goes back and erases everybody's memory. So you got to kind of start over. Peter Parker has to start over again and try to re-fall in love with Mary Jane, and everybody who knows him and everything. And that's kind of the storyline that people are trying to grapple, if you would, and how is he going to overcome that? And so currently, even though for 20 or so years he was always in high school, and you know, the comic world, you know, like 1 week was a few hours in comic world, if you would, you know, or 1 month was a few hours, because back then Spider-Man was a monthly title, and now it went bi-monthly. And but point being, yeah, you live a lot slower, you age a lot slower in the comic world than you do now. But yeah, that's kind of that's what we do.
One of the last things I want to ask you about a little bit would be the commercial code of comics, and when they started to look at violence in particular, and what was done to kind of regulate it.
Sure. Well, basically what had happened back in the 1950s, comics, you could argue, came around in the late 30s, early 40s, and everybody knows you know, Superman, Batman, so on like that, and the DC, which, you know, DC stands for Detective Comics, you know, that was their flagship comic. And then when you got into like the 40s and 50s, there were also some other titles, like we said, EC and so on, that were a little more grittier. And in fact, these are some of the original comics that were a little more grittier, you know, that EC Comics had. And they would depict, you know, violent scenes and so on like that. And in fact, I wish I had the key one of this has a decapitated woman with an axe dripping blood, and it's nasty, and I sadly don't have that issue, but these are you know, these are some of, and so in 1954 this guy Frederick Wertham wrote a book called The Seduction of the Innocent, and in his book he was basically arguing, you know, comics are bad because they're making kids do bad things and so on. And there was actually a congressional inquiry at that time that was going on, and you know, there was a senator, oh gosh, Estes Kerfover, I think, or Kerfover, Estes Kerfover, who took up the cause and started to, you know, there was a committee, a subcommittee on juvenile delinquency, and they had The Seduction of the Innocent, the book, and they were looking at it and they were going through it. They had, you know, Wertham come in and testify. And in fact, Wertham testified that in 1957, there was a Brooklyn, there was basically a group of kids, like a Brooklyn thrill kill things, that he said were influenced by these books, and that the kids that were reading them were, you know, influenced to do evil things. And they actually did a study that they looked at a couple of the prisons. And the funny thing is, like, the prisons that they looked at were basically like Lafargue Clinic and what was Bellevue Hospital, and they were looking at these and they were saying, oh, the kids that are in those places are influenced by these comics, when the people who work there were like, well, 70% of the kids in here have emotional problems, so it's not the comics. You know, it's like, you know, these kids are in real rough shape, and, you know, don't use these as triggers. So, you know, when these comics came out, and then further, they used some of the studies saying, well, even the comics, even DC themselves are starting to get into it, because if you look at it, William Martson, who started to draw Wonder Woman, like everybody knows Wonder Woman, right? And this was Wonder Woman of old. Wonder Woman of old was like, look, she's red, white, and blue, and life is good, and this is really great. But then when William Martson starts to draw him, all of a sudden out come all these like bondage covers, and Martson himself even said the same thing about, he goes, oh yeah, you know, we were making sure that Wonder Woman, you know, had, you know, we wanted to put her in like these darker times, and because it's the new Wonder Woman and stuff, and you know, and so they're sitting there going like, dude, what are you doing? You know. So, you know, these come out, and you get people like Martson saying, you know, agreeing with them, going, yeah, you know, we're trying to, you know, I mean, the guy's got an axe here, you know, and Wonder Woman's in chains. And so obviously this is what's going to lead to the Comic Code Authority. And that was the idea of trying to clean up the comics. And you know, they have relaxed their standards. In fact, you know, you couldn't have any type of zombies and things like that. That's why Morbius was a living vampire and not a zombie, because you weren't allowed to have zombies back then, and you know, stuff like that. And so it was a really interesting time. And when the 90s kicked in, a lot of people, you know, like a lot of people just for market share recognized that they didn't really care about the commercial code. So you in the 90s you had all these what we call bad girl comics come out, Lady Death, Cinnamon, you know, all these different you know, comic titles. I could have brought some in, but you know, I know it's a PG-13. There's a lot of like, there's a lot of the comic titles that totally went after, you know, 13-year-old kids to be like, oh wow, look there. I mean, you got to figure if you're a superheroine in a thong and a bikini top, and you can beat up the rest of the world. Come on, you know. And so this is what was happening, and so they kind of, you know, I mean, like the comics have definitely taken a really interesting turn when they started to do that. And does it have a market share? Well, of course it does. It'll always have a market share, but it won't be mainstream per se. You know, and that's what you run into. And so because of that, you know, the comics did take a different slant, and they did want to try to clean up you know, the comic industry, if you would. And so that's why the Comic Code Authority came in, and that's why you would have even something like the Tomb of Dracula, you would still have like the comic code up on the top, because, you know, even though it's a vampire in this case now, it's not, and this is when they kind of you know, we lowered the standards a little bit too, but they still wanted to make it approved for the parents and so on like that. And so that's kind of, you know, like where you see those comics. Some other comics that I brought along just to kind of go over where we are today a little bit. A lot of the way to catch people and to increase market share is by doing what we call like you know, when you look at the scarcity of comics back then and so on, we talked about comics have a value. Well, now what you have is like comics coming out with second, third, fourth printings, you know, which is something like you see here where, you know, you have a variant cover. We call these variant covers as well. Okay. You know, you have the regular comic, which you could buy, or you could buy, you know, what we call a variant cover. But then when the variant cover gets really hot and the other people want it, you could also do second and third printings as well, which is like usually, and it's in this case denoted by the different colors. This became a very popular comic this last year. For people because of the Spider-Man drawing, and they thought it looked really, really cool. So a lot of times by having variant covers, you can kind of sell 2 books for the price of 1, if you would, because people want the other cover. They'll pay the same amount of money. You know, a really horrible example is Action Comics 1000, where I want to say there was 50 different variant covers. The same with Batman, the Detective Comics the Detective Comics at a milestone as well, and they had about 50 covers. Spider-Man 800 had about 20 variant covers, and people would buy, you know, maybe 10 of them, right? Well, the thing is, it's the same story inside. They wanted the covers. So, you know, these big mega comics at this point too are anywhere between $8 and $10. So you're spending $100 for 10 comics. That's the same story, but you want the 10 different covers. So they have, you know, they have different. By doing the variant covers, it can increase Marvel and DC. Now that said, are there times where there's what we call classic covers where people have had spin-offs? Well, yeah, there's no question. In fact, one of the classic comics that, you know, people know in Spider-Man is Spider-Man 50. Yep. And it's a comic that, you know, Peter Parker was like, you know, he always struggled about not being Spider-Man anymore. So did he want to leave being Spider-Man, if you would? Well, this was such a great storyline, but this cover became an iconic cover. And so the next thing you know, Howard the Duck, to quack no more. You know, does Howard the Duck not want to be the Duck anymore, right? Peter Porker, the Spectacular Spider-Ham, does he not want to be, you know, Peter Porker anymore? You know, part of later on, they revisited the cover and they kind of did the same thing again. And so when there's iconic covers, a lot of times there's you know, I don't want to say rip-offs, but there's homages, if you would. Yeah. This here, a Hulk 340 by Todd McFarlane, was a classic cover of Hulk with a Wolverine claw and Hulk inside the claws. Well, because Todd McFarlane also draws Spawn, he did a alternate cover as well with Spawn.
Cool.
You know, but coming in with the Violator in the pictures.
Mm.
So a lot of times, like, it's really kind of neat. You see a lot of these classic covers get redone, and I have a number of copies. I just thought this would be like easy to illustrate.
That's a really cool one.
It is, and you know, the reality is comics go all over the world. Like one of the running jokes when as a teacher for 25 years, I would say, look, if I have a foreign exchange student in class, which I always did, I was, you know, I would always joke with them. I'd say, look, if you want to pass this class, you have to bring me a Spider-Man comic book from your country, or you know, it's not going to go well for you. And they knew I was joking, but they also knew I love Spider-Man. So you know, a lot of times they would bring me, you know, a comic from their country, and I would make a little homage to it, and I have them, you know, and this is, you know, this is the actual U.S. cover, and this is the cover. In this case, this is the Spectacular Spider-Man. This is actually from Germany, which is really kind of cool. And this is the Italian version. L'Uomo Ragno is actually Spider-Man in Italy. So, I mean, and I have comics from France and from Ukraine and from Thailand, and they're all Spider-Man, and they're really, really cool, you know, comic books to get. And the kids, you know, but the point being is these comic books go all over the world. And so when you look at, like, I mean, a lot of people talk about American economy. Our #1 export in the United States is actually pop culture. We export more, our pop culture is the #1 thing that the rest of the world picks up. Everybody, no matter what country you're in, they all know Madonna. They all know Prince. They all know Michael Jackson. They all know the Avengers. They all know Spider-Man, you know. So when you look at what the rest of the world knows about the United States, sure, they all think it's Disney and Beverly Hills 90210, but the reality is it's our pop culture that is our #1 export. So this is why the market share, especially with superhero comics and so on, can go all over the world, because everybody all over the world reads Spider-Man and reads the Avengers and reads, you know, all these superhero books, you know.
So is that why like early Marvel tended to take place like all in New York, or like all in, and then over time you started seeing more of these exotic locations?
I would agree with that, because if well, actually DC Comics itself is still their home base is still Rockefeller Plaza. Yeah, so like, you know, right there, you know. And Gotham City, if I was better at this, I would know. Gotham City is someplace in New Jersey, actually, like right across the border. Because like really, New Jersey and New York City is like right there. You know, in fact, the Statue of Liberty, one of the big Supreme Court cases was who actually owns this Statue of Liberty. Does New Jersey own it, or does New York own it? And you know, so when you look at you know, like, but Gotham City is supposed to take place right inside New Jersey, right over the border in New Jersey. And then all of a sudden you're starting to, well, for example, when Black Panther was done, like when Wakanda, one of my former students, who was an amazing student, got to go, oh my gosh, if I was a better person, where they believe Wakanda was in Africa, she got to go to the premiere of the Black Panther there, and it was a gala. I mean, they had everybody and their brother was out. It was like a red carpet affair for the premiere of Black Panther, and they looked at that as such a rich gem, if you would, like, because this is, you know, when you figure out where Wakanda would have been, you know. And she was wined and dined, and she goes, she had this amazing robes and stuff, and she goes, it was just an experience I will never forget. But you're right, like you see that the comics have, you know, like the people that have expanded worldwide, where you see you know, the comics taking place. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, Dave, I really, again, kind of want to reiterate how grateful we are to have had this conversation with you. I mean, there's such a vast and rich history here, and to be able to talk about and kind of chomp it all down and is a feat for sure. But we did a lot of it, and I'm super happy about it, and I think that our listeners are going to find a lot of value in this. And again, thanks for inviting us over here to interview you a bit. And
it's my pleasure. And Granitown Media does an amazing job of putting this together. And I want to, without a doubt, just continue to say, please keep reading, people. Like, the more you read, the more literacy, the more fun, and the more enjoyment. You'll have no problem getting lost in storylines. Some of the best papers I ever wrote when I was in high school were storylines from comic books that, you know, to this day. And in fact, I'll never forget in my 10th grade English class when we were doing Norse mythology, and I was rattling off all the Norse gods and goddesses. My teacher looked at me and she goes, "You are just the smartest kid in the world." And I sat there going, "No, I read Thor comics." You know? So this could be you.
There you have it. That's awesome. Well,
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
No problem. Let's
Really
have a lot.
appreciate it.
Let's do this again.
Yeah, we should stay in touch. Cool.